the Chinese Communist Party, the best way to think about that is the Chinese Communist Party is essentially the meritocratic elite. And you don't get into the Chinese Communist Party if you're not very able. You don't get to Tsinghua University if you're not very able. 10 million kids a year take the national examinations to go to university. The top 3,000 of those go to Tsinghua University. 3,000 get admitted and 3,000 go. And so, and Tsinghua University accounts for 50% of the leadership of the country. So that the examination-based culture, which has existed for 2,000 years, still exists, and essentially, that's what drives the input into all these institutions. And so, to put it in the vernacular, if you get to the top of the Chinese system, there's no chance you're not very smart and very able.
都说美国代表民主，中国代表专制，可这一次说出完全相反观点的，竟然是高盛原总裁、清华大学顾问委员会委员约翰·桑顿。他在公开演讲中直言，美国越来越像富豪统治，而中国更像精英统治。这番话一出，不仅让现场主持人一度陷入沉默，也让不少美国网友开始反思：我们一直相信的那套叙事，真的还是现实吗？
If you were reading today the characterization of One Belt, One Road, you would think this was some kind of malevolent tactic to get control of the world on the part of the Chinese, which it is not. It is exactly what it's said, what they say it is, which is to extend a model of development into as many countries as it wanted, who desperately need it. And when I talked earlier about Chinese modernization that I attended this last Monday, so Chinese modernization, I won't go into all the details, but there basically are 5 central characteristics of it, one of which is a peaceful world. Second one of which is common prosperity. Third one of which is harmony between man and nature. So the foreign minister went through this whole thing, and then there were 5 of us asked to comment on it. And I said, in my comments, I said, listen, those of us who have ever run anything know, plans are one thing, execution is another. Execution is the whole thing. So my advice to you, the Chinese, would be, if you're going to hold yourself out as believing in these things, I mean, who's against any of these things? Who's against world peace? Who's against harmony between man and nature? Who's against common prosperity? Nobody. 10 out of 10 people. There's nobody in this room who's going to be against any of these things. So that's not the issue. The issue is, are you actually going to do what you say you do? And if you don't, you're going to suffer the same negative blowback that countries like the United States get when they were seen as being hypocritical. So that's point number 1. Point number 2, which is extremely important, and a point I want to make to all of you, which I made to the Chinese till I'm blue in the face very unsuccessfully, which is, when I first started spending a lot of time in China was I was chairman of Goldman Sachs Asia in the mid-90s into 2000. At a point in time when the Chinese system was just starting to open up, and they were just starting to put state-owned enterprises into Western markets, and Zhu Rongji was the premier, or vice premier, then premier, and he was a very unusual person, and he really cared about getting this right, and I happened to be there, and I was very senior, so I was in exactly the right place at exactly the right time to give him advice in a way that will probably never occur again, because the Chinese were so needed with advice. But one thing that struck me about them was the Chinese leadership on almost every topic, not every topic, but almost every topic, was systematically open in the following sense. They started with the premise, there's somebody in the world who knows this topic better than we do. Let's get that somebody to Beijing. Let's drain his brain. Let's study what he had to say, see if it applies to us, refine it and customize for our circumstance, and then execute. And they did this time after time after time. But my point is, systematically open, except I said to them, listen, one topic you missed, which is the English language dominates the world's communication channels. And you recognize that. But you literally don't participate in them at all. So the Chinese story, as it were, is told by people who are not Chinese. And guess what? They don't know the story as well. They don't tell it as well. And so it's entirely absent. And until you start to get into those channels, you're going to be at a big, big disadvantage. So when you talk about Chinese modernization, coming back to that, if you believe it, number one, you've got to deliver on it. And number two, you've got to communicate it in such a way that the external world, particularly the English language world, takes it in and believes it. And right now you're failing miserably on that count. And until that gets corrected, it's never going to solve that problem. This, by the way, another one of my pet peeves is that last November I was having breakfast in New York with a very senior Chinese official, just one-on-one with a note-taker. And in the first 5 minutes, the official said to me, "It's so frustrating to us that senior Americans never read anything that we put out. Instead, what they do is they listen to so-called experts, Western experts, who interpret our documents for these, let's say, the senior people in this country." Mm-hmm. And he gave a specific example. He said, for example, Kevin Rudd, this is him talking. Kevin Rudd, who I know very well. He's a good guy. He knows China quite well. Again, Kevin Rudd's got a whole theory about what we're doing now. And a lot of people listen to him. He said the problem is Kevin Rudd's wrong. And I don't know how to correct that. And when he said that, I said, I recognize exactly what you're saying. It relates to what I was just saying a minute ago. But in addition to which, here I've got a book, for example, written by a senior Chinese, comparing the Warring States period in China with ancient Greece. So a frustration of mine is, as much as I know or don't know about China, and I know that an outsider to a culture can never be an insider. So the most you can ever hope to be is kind of a synthetic insider by building relationships with people. But one thing I know after all these years is that as much as I think I know on something, if I don't test it with a close Chinese friend, I'm going to be off. Sometimes a little bit and sometimes a lot. And so I tried as much as I can to read things that the Chinese themselves actually write. And by the way, this is an aside, with respect to the Chinese government, when they say they're going to do something, chances are very high they're going to do it. And in contrast, for example, to our State of the Union, which is basically a speech about the future and about hope, the Chinese have a thing they call the equivalent in China is the Chinese work report, which tells you exactly what they actually did for real and what they're going to do for real. It's a completely different document. All right. Now, I just want to read you one thing here, though, that sort of captures, I think, a very good sentiment. Bear with me here 1 second. Okay, here we are. The power configuration in the current world should not be defined as competition between China and the United States for hegemony. Rather, we witness a shift from the situation in which a single civilization dominated the globe to common prosperity of diverse civilizations. What China has inaugurated is not a Chinese century, but a century of diverse civilizations, a new era in which there will no longer be a single civilizational hegemon. And that's exactly the way the Chinese see it. As opposed to, Joe Biden says this is the century of democracies versus autocracies. Some of the funnier, more clever Chinese will say, no, it's the plutocracy versus the meritocracy. Which gets to the Chinese Communist Party. The Chinese Communist Party, the best way to think about that is the Chinese Communist Party is essentially the meritocratic elite. And you don't get into the Chinese Communist Party if you're not very able. You don't get to Tsinghua University if you're not very able. 10 million kids a year take the national examinations to go to university. The top 3,000 of those go to Tsinghua University. 3,000 get admitted and 3,000 go. And so, and Tsinghua University accounts for 50% of the leadership of the country. So that the examination-based culture, which has existed for 2,000 years, still exists, and essentially, that's what drives the input into all these institutions. And so, to put it in the vernacular, if you get to the top of the Chinese system, there's no chance you're not very smart and very able. Mm-hmm. And the only institution in this country which is, to me, is at all like it, and when I tell them this, it drives them crazy, the only institution in this country that's at all like the Chinese Communist Party is the U.S. military. Which is to say that if you and I were 18 years old and we went to West Point together, and we went in the military and we stayed in the military, one day we're 4-star generals, we've known each other for, whatever it is, 40 years, and we're sitting around the same table. That's the Chinese system. And so they know each other intimately. They've had real jobs. They failed or they succeeded. If they succeeded, they went ahead. If they failed, they failed. But the other day, another Chinese was saying to me, the capitalist system is essentially a divide and conquer system. The Chinese modernization is a unifying system. The common prosperity is for real. They're proud of the fact they've lifted 800 million people out of poverty. Well, that's the most ever in history by a long, long way. And they're proud of that. And they think those people ought to continue to advance. And that this, these big, big differences between the wealthy and the poor is too much. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And that's why you see them sort of cracking down now on some of that. When the two biggest countries, the two most powerful countries, start getting antagonistic towards one another, what's causing what, right? And it may not even be a useful exercise to try to figure out what caused what. But you inspire me on one other point I wanted to make, which is this. I had thought incorrectly that when Biden became president, we would have, for the first time in history, an asset we never had before, which was an incoming president who already had a good relationship with the existing Chinese president. So I thought, incorrectly, that Biden, being a good politician, would realize his first phone call and say, looking forward to working with you, we can do this, that, and the other thing together, blah, blah, blah. He did exactly the opposite. They literally decided, no, what we have to do is we have to talk to everybody else in the world first, particularly the allies, get us all together coherently, and then talk to the Chinese. So then I started thinking, okay, now Biden says routinely, as all American presidents have recently, the U.S.-China relationship is the most important relationship of the 21st century. Of course, I agree with that. And so then if you kind of conceptualize the President of the United States as sort of the CEO of the country, and the CEO of the country has just said, okay, the most important relationship is U.S.-China. Now, if you were running a company and you had your key people around the table, let's say your cabinet, as it were, and that was your directive, you would think that everybody who's senior ought to be all over that topic, right? So now, I've often done this sort of thought exercise in my head. If you went around the cabinet table and you said to each cabinet member, tell me the name of your Chinese counterpart, I'll bet you 90% of them couldn't tell you. Let alone if you were to say, on a scale of 1 to 10, grade your relationship with your counterpart. The answer to that would be 0. So there's a fundamental disconnect here, which to me it's almost political malpractice. And by the way, I say the same thing about the Chinese. This goes both ways. I'm picking on our own country because it's more polite to talk about your own country. It goes both ways. I mean, it's completely intolerable. Obviously, we all know just through, this is like human relations 101, right? If you want to build a relationship with someone, guess what? You got to talk to them. And if you want to build any kind of trust or even diminish fear, the better you know him or her, the better. Or even if you're wanting to make a judgment on what do I think about person A, B, or C, isn't it a good idea to spend a lot of time with him or her? They're doing none of that.
这期视频最值得关注的不是约翰·桑顿站在哪一边，而是他揭开了一个很多西方媒体很少讨论的话题：一个国家的竞争力到底来自资本还是来自人才？他说，美国政治越来越受到资本力量影响。根据公开数据，美国2024年总统大选总支出超过150亿美元，刷新历史记录。而在美国国会，百万富翁议员占比长期超过50%。 资本、游说集团和政治捐款正在深度影响政策制定。这也是为什么他会用一句话概括：美国越来越像富豪统治。反观中国，他认为更强调的是干部选拔和长期培养，从基层历练到地方治理，再到更高层级，形成了一套以治理能力为核心的培养体系。无论是否认同这种观点，他至少提出了一个值得思考的问题：一个国家的领导者是靠资本竞争出来，还是靠治理能力成长起来？对国家的发展会产生怎样不同的结果？